Hey, what's up folks, how's it going? This is Watch for MW Technology, and today we're going to be doing a head-to-head camera comparison between the iPhone 16 Pro Max and the S24 Ultra. You're taking a look at the front-facing camera, recording at 60 FPS 4K resolution, but we're going to be specifically focusing on the rear array of cameras, specifically talking about its overall sharpness, clarity levels, color rendition, as well as low-light performance both in stills mode and the video capabilities to determine which camera is more versatile, superior, and overall better. So let's get into it. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about these stills differences between these two. You're going to see that the S24 Ultra for fine detail will have more clarity and sharpness because one, it has greater resolution with the 200 megapixels, but it's kind of a double-edged sword. You are getting a lot of post-processing happening with the Samsung. It kind of smooths out texture, and we lose kind of the fine detail that's made up of certain materials. So for example, this Leonardo Ninja Turtle figure is made out of foam, and we actually capture the foam texture quite well on the chest. If you take a look at the iPhone still image versus the Samsung, kind of smooths everything out and kind of makes everything a little bit more even. This would be fine if it was skin tones and you want to kind of hide blemishes or have an airbrush effect, but you're losing the original integrity of the image by doing so. Furthermore, we can also illustrate this by these two Joker figures. One is a more natural looking skin tone on this Joker. Obviously the colors are different, but for the purpose of this video, you can see that on the Samsung, that the texture on the skin is pretty much smoothed out compared to the pores that you can see individually on the iPhone, which is again more realistic, and we have this kind of smudged out airbrush effect on the Samsung. Now with this Joker figure, with this extreme amount of wrinkling, we're not losing too much texture detail, and in fact the overall sharpness is pretty staggering on this particular image when you take a look at the Samsung compared to the iPhone, but we are losing some highlight and shadow information compared to the iPhone, and it's just not as realistic as the iPhone. Beyond that, you can also see quite a bit of image noise on the iPhone image compared to the Samsung, which uses a lot of noise reduction software to make the image as clean as possible. That could be a good thing or a bad thing depending upon if you're going for a more realistic look or a more polished look straight out of the box. Moving forward, on this image, you can see the Chappie robot is a lot better defined with the extra 200 megapixels we have on the Samsung compared to 48 megapixels. But if you do zoom in to some extreme contrast areas, specifically where there's block lettering on a black background, for example, you do see a little bit of chromatic aberration on the Samsung, which is not as apparent on the iPhone, but generally you're never going to see that, especially if you're just looking at on the smartphone display. Now outside, when you have a decent amount of light, both do a great job of delivering some fairly realistic looking images, although I do find that the iPhone is a tad more realistic. And for example, if you can see over here, the blue skies are a little bit more bluer on the iPhone compared to the Samsung, but there's not a massive difference, and you can obviously change that later on. And there's less overall micro contrast on the iPhone image, being just a little bit more flatter. Again, that's personal preference, but I wouldn't say one image looks inherently better than the rest. You are going to get obviously more general sharpness with that higher resolution image processor that the Samsung has. Now with this shot, I shot directly at the sunset, and you can see that the iPhone is less overall sharp compared to the Samsung, which is inherently the case, but it's actually doing a great job of handling that sun flare. And then you can see that there's more sky information in the clouds, and around the sun is less blown out compared to the Samsung. And there's also more sun stars, kind of a lensing effect that you see on the Samsung image compared to the iPhone. Now for the most part, the quality on the main cameras is pretty comparable, but the story quickly changes once we move to the telephoto cameras. At 5x optical zoom, you're looking at 12 megapixels on the iPhone versus 50 megapixels on the S24 Ultra. And that's going to resolve at least 3 to 4 times more detail. And if you watch this video in the full quality, the difference is quite obvious. You're at least getting twice the visual details in far distant objects. For example, buildings are more defined, the tree lines have better visibility, and you can see textures in the mountains in the far distance on the Samsung compared to it's generally more blurry and less distinctive on the iPhone camera. This is another shot of far distant buildings under the bridge over here, and just the Samsung looks clear, has better dynamic range, and you don't even have to zoom in all the way to see that difference inherently. Now, beyond the telephoto stills, let's talk about low light performance in still specifically. Now, this is an extreme test. This is pretty mumuch pitch black. I can't really see anything with my naked eye besides the buildings in the far distance. You can see that we have more details in the shadows, and the iPhone can just resolve things that are kind of magical where you never know that they're there. It's truly night vision level photography over here, and it does have a better algorithm for stabilization for night or low light mode, so it does a good job of kind of predicting where your hand movement is going to be, and you have less streaking or blurring effects. The Samsung also has fairly good stabilization with minimal kind of shutter lag and overall motion blur, but it's just a little bit more contrastier, and you have less details in the shadow specifically. Pretty good overall clarity with the higher resolution, and obviously Samsung's been doing this for quite a while, but just the overall amount of shadow details that you can get out of the iPhone is next level. Take a look at this example with the dock over here, where you could see the dock is clearly defined in the shadows at the bottom segment of the screen versus on the Samsung. You can see some mooring or aliasing effects with that dock texture, and it's just not as clear. I do have to say that the iPhone night mode is a little bit more consistent with delivering pretty much 8 out of 10 usable photos, versus the Samsung is a little bit more hit and miss 50% of the time, where the image just don't look rightly exposed and there's more motion blur than I would like. But the Samsung can still resolve some great looking low light photography. Take a look at this house, for example. There's very little difference between the Samsung and the iPhone, and you could even see more kind of highlight retention detail on the Samsung because it actually exposed it right, where we can actually see details inside the house, versus the iPhone prioritized the shadows and we lost some of the highlight details through that window. Now, as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of post-processing that the Samsung inherently does compared to the iPhone, so it tries to make the best looking image possible out of the camera, and that can definitely work towards its benefit. For example, if you're taking a picture of a sign in this extreme low light situation, you can see that the green is more green on the Samsung and the text is more defined with the better contrast and overall resolution and clarity compared to the iPhone, which just looks a little bit more washed out. Granted, more accurate because this is kind of incandescent kind of yellow light that we're working with, and the green wasn't actually this green. But if you're looking for a more polished image out of the box, the Samsung does a great job of delivering that. Now, moving on in terms of the video capturing capabilities. Now, obviously the Samsung has been doing 8K video for many years, and that hasn't changed with the S24 Ultra. The iPhone doesn't have 8K, but it does have 4K 120, which the Samsung doesn't. So if you want to shoot 4K slow-mo, that's a greater possibility with the iPhone compared to the Samsung. Just for recording options, the iPhone has a ton of industry standard recording options for Dolby Vision, 10-bit, HDR video capturing capabilities, up to ProRes codec with extremely high bit rates that you might need an SD card or an expansion SSD drive to actually record. So for extreme filmmaking circumstances, if you need that extra latitude, if you want to do log for color timing and grading, that is a greater capability with the iPhone. And generally speaking, the iPhone has been really an awesome video capturing camera for a smartphone. And this is certainly no exception with the 16 Pro Max. Now you can see over here with this overview shot, shout out to Toy Traders in Langley for letting me film at their awesome store with tons of details in here. And both, just straight looking at the video footage itself, both look great. But if we zoom into some fine details specifically at this sign, you can see with the greater contrast level that the S24 Ultra has, we could see that this sign is a little bit more defined. It says Star Wars Kessel Run, a little bit easier to read on the Samsung compared to the iPhone, but you're never going to be really zooming in. But if you need to, I think in terms of micro contrast, the Samsung has a little edge up there. But this iPhone has been really famous for highlight blooming, and it's plagued by lens flare issues, especially in low light situations. It does a great job in low light performance specifically, which we'll talk about later, but it's always been an issue, and the 16 Pro Max and standard 16 Pro is no different. There's tons of lens flares, which can be pretty distracting, and the Samsung doesn't have that inherent problem. Now, in terms of color accuracy and overall dynamic range, the iPhone is ahead by quite a margin, especially if you're looking at detail shots. Take a look at this pinball machine over here. On the iPhone, you could see the individual texture of the paint finish and the transitional colors between color gradients. Versus on the Samsung, because of its post-processing, it kind of loses all that fine texture details, and color smoothing plagues it tremendously, and we lose a lot of the fine gradients and transitional colors that's still retained on the iPhone. So the iPhone is a lot more true to life. Now, one of the big trademarks of the iPhone is that it prioritizes shadow details, sometimes over everything else. That can be a good or bad thing, but this is a great example over here with this bridge shot where if we zoom in, we can see that a lot of those shadow details are pretty well preserved on the iPhone, and we have less details in the highlight information, especially in the clouds, compared to the Samsung, which is kind of the opposite effect in the stills that we encountered before. But in this particular example, the Samsung is doing a better job in terms of handling sun flares, and overall highlight blooming is less of an issue compared to the iPhone video. Now, looking at the 5x optical zoom camera, it's pretty much the same story as we encountered with the stills. Because we're working with a higher resolution, you are going to resolve more detail on the Samsung when you use that telephoto, both for videos and stills. We can see more information in distant objects, textures are better defined, and just a better looking video footage when you're looking at the zoom capabilities on the Samsung. Now let's get to the biggest selling feature of the iPhone for me personally, and that's a low light video performance. It's pretty next level. Take a look at this shot over here with the external walls on this old house. This is very extremely low light conditions, and you can see on the Samsung we have quite a bit of motion streaking going on, a lot of motion blur, because the shutter speed has to be really turned down quite a bit to maintain proper exposure and to have somewhat of a high dynamic range. And if we take a look at the iPhone image, you have less motion streaking, less overall motion blur, and the clarity is quite staggering. You can just see details where the Samsung can just plainly not see. And if you have a little bit more light in this porch scene over here, you can see that the rock face has at least twice the level of details and clarity on the iPhone video compared to the Samsung, and the color accuracy is a lot more accurate on the iPhone as well. This is still the biggest kind of selling feature of the iPhone, specifically for low light video, and that's still the case with the latest generation 16 Pro. Now, in summary, I would say that the iPhone is definitely the more realistic looking camera, both in stills and video capturing capabilities. Especially for video capturing capabilities, it is still far superior than the Samsung in my opinion. And in terms of the Samsung's post-processing capabilities, a lot of that stuff can be fine-tuned to make it more realistic, and you can certainly use third-party apps that will turn off some of the post-processing to make it more realistic. But out of the box, the iPhone is more realistic, and plus with the new photographic styles, you can kind of make it look like a post-processed polished image fairly easily. And obviously you have the 4K 120 FPS if that's important to you, but probably the biggest weak factor and the advantages that the Samsung has over the iPhone is the telephoto camera. I think Apple specifically chose not to put a 48 megapixel telephoto camera in there just to have something for the iPhone 17 Pro Max or whatever. That's just one of their marketing things that they're probably going to add later on down the road, and it's definitely the weakest part of this camera array. Now, besides that, guys, that's really it. Now, we also have another camera comparison comparing the Pixel Pro XL versus the 16 Pro Max. We'll have that on the channel or linked in the description, so check that video out. In the meantime, definitely love to know what you guys think of the new cameras on the 16 Pro Max. Is it worth upgrading to if you're just coming from a 2 or 3 generation old iPhone? For the most part, these are incremental upgrades year to year, but love to hear your thoughts. Please give us a thumbs up if you haven't done so already. Check out the descriptions for everything we've talked about. Subscribe and have post notifications turned on. We'll see you real soon in the next one. Take care.